So far we've covered the first 5 books of the Tanakh, or the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We've also covered the first 2 books of the former prophets, Joshua and Judges. In this video, we're going to go over the second 2 books of the former prophets, Samuel and Kings. And I want to remind you again as we go over this, the dates that are being provided are still pretty broad estimations. We don't have archaeological or other historical corroboration for these. And so theologians are going to argue maybe even 200 years one way or the other. This is kind of the happy medium that I'm providing. Because again, these stories are written down hundreds of years after the events supposedly took place. These stories are based on folk tales. They're based on stories and writings from Mesopotamia and from Egypt. You might remember some of the things like the parallels with the Sargon or the Gilgamesh's flood narratives. They're based on the political constraints and the ideologies of the royal court, where most of them are being written. They're based on the political desires of the priests working in the temple. And of course, they're based on the ideas and the understandings of the actual scribes who were writing them down. So when we left off in the 16th century, the Israelites had moved to Canaan because of a famine. By the 15th century BCE, they were enslaved by the Pharaoh because he was scared there were too many of them. In the late 13th century, an Israelite named Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt after sending those 10 plagues onto the kingdom of Egypt. They wandered the wilderness for 40 years. And then in the early 12th century, in the early 1100s BCE, they crossed over the Jordan River after Moses had died, led by Joshua, and they conquered the land of Canaan. That, of course, is the book of Joshua. In the mid-12th century through the 11th century, we have the period of Judges, the time where the Israelites are living in separate tribal territories. They're not unified, though sometimes a judge would unify a few tribes to fight back against a common enemy. And the most common threat to them throughout those times were the Philistines. And we actually do know who the Philistines were. They are remnants of the sea peoples, the people that had played such a big role in the destruction of the old Bronze Age. And by the time we got to the late 11th century BCE, and this is true not just in the biblical narrative, but in a lot of the areas around the Levant, power was again starting to become more centralized. And so the Hebrews were feeling, according to the story, that they didn't need this ad hoc system of every now and then they would team up. They needed a permanent centralized power in order to deal with the threat of the Philistines. They needed a permanent institution. They needed a king. So the next book after Judges is the book of Samuel. Now Samuel himself was a priest. He was also seen as a prophet. And he was seen as a judge. He's essentially the very last judge. He is the big trifecta. Though this book is not just about Samuel, it's also about the early kings of Israel. As I said, the Philistines were becoming a major problem during the life of Samuel. He led Israelites in a major victory and battle against the Philistines, but there was growing concern that that ad hoc system of judges just wasn't going to cut it. The leaders of the tribes asked Samuel to find and anoint a king. Samuel says having kings would be a really bad idea, that prophets and judges would be more righteous, that kings would inevitably become corrupt with power. But when the Israelites say they still want one, Samuel goes looking. God tells him to choose a man named Saul to fight against the Philistines. And according to the book of Samuel, the big thing that made Saul really stick out is he was super tall, right? And he's supposed to be a war leader. That's really what they're looking for, is a permanent war leader to push back against Philistine power. The ceremony that God has Samuel do is he has him fill a horn with the best olive oil, which is really expensive stuff, and pour it over his head. Anoint him with this oil. This is going to become the process that Israelite kings are used. This is their coronation process. We often think about the king having a crown placed on his head. The pouring of this expensive olive oil over his head will become the symbol. And the actual term for that, at least the English translation of the term for that, is Messiah. Messiah just means God's anointed one, God's chosen one. It just means, really, king or leader, the one that was chosen to lead God's people. So the first anointed one, first Messiah, was Saul. And at first, Saul does great. He defeats several Israelite enemies. He gives amnesty to people who opposed his kingship, because not all Israelites were happy about his choosing. But after a while, Samuel starts to get frustrated with Saul. Before a major battle, Samuel told Saul to wait for him to make sacrifices to God. And Samuel took a long time to get to the front. Saul got kind of antsy, and he did the sacrifices himself. Samuel is really upset about being left out of this ritual. Later, when it came time for a battle against an old enemy of the Israelites, the Amalekites, Samuel actually delivers a message directly from God to Saul. And this is according to 1 Samuel 15:2-3. Thus say the Lord of hosts. Lord of hosts is essentially like the Lord of armies, the guy that's going to lead us in battle. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. The Amalekites didn't submit like they should have. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Wipe them out. This is again one of those genocidal moments in the Old Testament. Saul goes and he does most of this. But Saul decides that he wants to keep the best livestock for himself and for sacrifices, and he lets the king of Amalek live. For this, God says he regrets ever choosing Saul. Saul is clearly disobedient. He was told to wipe everybody out, wipe out every living thing, and Saul didn't do it. And because Yahweh regrets his decision for choosing Saul, he sends Samuel to go out and find a new king. Samuel goes and meets a man named Jesse, an older man that has a bunch of sons, and he asks to see Jesse's son. The youngest son turns out to be chosen by God, a man named David. And in secret, without anybody else knowing, Samuel anoints David, who's really just a kid at this point. In other words, Samuel makes David the king, but in secret, or at least he makes it clear that David is God's chosen one. You might remember, going back to like the story of Jacob, God doesn't choose people necessarily because they're good. It's just because he chooses them. That's enough. Meanwhile, back at court, King Saul is having a lot of mental health issues. One of the lines in Samuel is that an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Remember, evil doesn't mean like a grand force of evil trying to destroy good. It means unnatural, out of comfort, hurtful, painful. Saul figures he needs a musician to soothe him. Somebody at court says they heard of this shepherd kid who could play a really mean lyre, a really mean harp. That kid actually turns out to be David. And so David is brought to the court to help Saul chill out. Remember, David has already been secretly anointed king, but this kid's hanging out in court, he's playing music for Saul. When Saul gets all bent out of shape, David plays in some chilled music, and it calms Saul down. And it should be noted that later on, David is said to have written most of the psalms, most of the songs to God. So part of David's mythology is that he's not just going to end up being a great king, he's a pretty good musician too. Now when it came to battling the Philistines, Saul wanted to keep David around, and he made David his arms bearer, which meant, David carried his sword and maybe even his armor for him. And at one point, there was actually a standoff between the armies of Israel and the Philistines. And while the two were waiting on their opposite sides of the battlefield, none of them for a long time wanted to actually make the first move. But there was a Philistine warrior, a man named Goliath, who came out every day calling for single combat. The idea of instead of us all fighting, let you send out your best, I'm the best over here on the side of the Philistines, we'll duke it out. Whoever wins that battle wins the whole battle. For 40 days. Again, 40. That number pops up again and again. For 40 days, Goliath came out asking for combat. Saul tries to get somebody to be his champion. He offers money, he offers his daughter's hand in marriage for whoever can kill Goliath, but nobody was brave enough. Until David shows up. It's kind of a weird, unclear part of the story, but evidently David had been hanging out at home for a while and just came back to the battlefront. David volunteers, and he goes out to combat without armor or any major weapons. Saul even tries to hook him up with armor, and David's like, I don't need to be constrained by any of that. Goliath talks smack about this little guy. He doesn't have a sword. All he has is a shepherd's sling. But David uses this sling, puts a rock in it, throws the rock, it hits Goliath right smack dab in the middle of the forehead and kills him. And I want us to remember again, both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, the idea of a king being a shepherd of his people is a very popular image. We have it right here. King David is a shepherd, ready to shepherd his people. He's using a shepherd's weapon. Now, of course, David's supposed to get Saul's daughter's hand in marriage. That was the promise. But Saul doesn't hook him up right away. Instead, Saul makes David the commander of a force and sets him off on very dangerous missions. He's trying to get David killed. He's a little jealous of this guy that's becoming really popular. On a couple of occasions, Saul has mental breaks, and he actually tries to kill David. Eventually, he offers his daughter's hand in marriage, but David doesn't want the daughter that's being offered to him. He wants a different daughter. And in order to get her, Saul demands that David goes out and he brings back 100 Philistine foreskins. In other words, David needs to go out and kill 100 Philistines and cut off the tip of their penis, or cut off that skin on the tip of their penis, and bring it back. David goes out and kills 200 and brings back 200 foreskins.
So Saul allows him to marry the daughter he wanted, Michal.
But Saul still is jealous of David, and he keeps trying to kill him, to the point that David has to run away. It becomes too dangerous for him to stay at court. David hides out with various peoples, his family for a while, then he hangs out in Levite cities. Remember how they were sanctuary cities? He even goes and lives with the Philistines for a while. Saul is out chasing him around, trying to track down David. He's in that full rage moment. He even massacres every Israelite in the city of Nob because he feels like they should have turned David over to them. Saul is clearly losing it. There is one point where Saul is close to David. David gets a chance, or actually sees Saul, and Saul goes to take a leak. David gets a chance to kill him, but doesn't do it. Because David essentially is like, hey, I could have done it, but I didn't, Saul recognizes David as the next king. Unfortunately, we're dealing with a guy who's not stable. And so Samuel, after this incident, Samuel dies, he was old, and after Samuel's death, Saul once again decides he's going to kill David. For a while, David teams up with Philistines against Saul, but before battle, Saul really wants a prophetic, some type of prophetic wisdom. He doesn't have Samuel to tell him what to do anymore. And so in order to try to get some type of prophecy, Saul decides to go visit a witch at a place called Endor. When he talks to this witch, she conjures up what's called in the Bible the gods. It's a little bit unclear. Again, we're not talking about monotheistic culture yet, but the idea that she's going to cover up gods or conjure up gods, it is a little weird, especially since one of those gods is Samuel. Maybe a better word would be she conjures up spirits, and Samuel is one of the spirits that she conjures up. Saul asks Samuel what to do, and Samuel tells him to kick rocks. Says, like, what are you doing? I was resting. You shouldn't have done this. And since Saul didn't kill everybody at that battle way back in the day when God told him to, Samuel tells Saul he's not only going to lose the upcoming battle, he's going to die along with 3 of his sons. And that's exactly what happens the next day. After Saul's death, his son Eshbaal is made king.
But only the northern tribes recognize him as such.
David came from the tribe of Judah to the south, and it seems pretty clear in the archaeological record the people of Judah were always pretty distinct from the people of the northern kingdom of Israel. And so this is where we get our first, in the story at least, the first clear division. Judah does not join up with Saul's son. Judah follows David. 2 years later, Eshbaal's commanders, or at least 2 of his commanders, assassinate him so that David can become the king of the unified Israelites, of the northern tribes as well as the tribe of Judah. David sees this as an unlawful thing. He actually executes the people who assassinated Eshbaal. But David is made king of all of Israel. He is anointed again by all the elders of the rest of the tribes.
This happens around the year 1000 BCE. If you look down here at the bottom of the screen, you see this R and this C. R just means reigned. C just means circa, or around. So David reigned around the years 1000 to 960 BCE.
And David, for his part, is now starting to think he needs a capital city. If we're going to have a king, a standing institution that's separate from all the different tribes, that king needs to have his own city that, again, is separate from the rest of the tribes. So David decides to attack a group of people called the Jebusites. The Jebusites had their home in a city called Jerusalem. David is able to take the city of Jerusalem. He then took its inner citadel. A citadel is like the castle in the middle of a city. That inner citadel was on Mount Zion. And it is worth noting that Zion sometimes will come to mean all of Jerusalem. Sometimes it will come to mean all of the land of Israel.
This is where the modern term Zionism comes from, and Zionism is just the ideal of establishing a Jewish homeland in places like Jerusalem and the rest of the lands that the ancient Israelites had conquered, or at least according to the Hebrew Bible, had conquered.
So David made Jerusalem his capital. He hired a bunch of Phoenicians, people up in the north, other Canaanites in the north, to build him a palace. He then had the Ark of the Covenant brought there along with the tabernacle, had the tabernacle set up in Jerusalem. Remember, the tabernacle is the place where God lives, and the tabernacle, along with the Ark of the Covenant in it, had been moved around to different cities ever since the time of Judges. It is now going to have a permanent home in the city of Jerusalem. David himself wanted to build a house for God. He wanted to get rid of the tabernacle tent and actually build a temple. But Yahweh said it wouldn't be David, it would be his son who's going to carry that out. In fact, Yahweh calls David his son. This is worth noting. In the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, there are several Israelite or Judean kings who are likened to gods themselves, that the line between king and God is kind of fuzzy. A lot of them are called Son of God. We often, in the Christian world, associate that term with Jesus. But it's not just applied to Jesus. David is called a son of God. And again, if you remember anything about Mesopotamian and Egyptian religion, this is kind of a common thing for kings, to have this fuzzy line between being kind of divine themselves and just being attached to the divine world. Yahweh makes a covenant with David and says that his line, his descendants, will rule Israel for all eternity. This is not going to turn out to be true, but it is going to be an important claim for the Davidic line, for their power. The book of Samuel goes on to tell of David slaughtering the enemies of Israel, but over time, as Samuel predicted, David becomes slightly corrupt. One example of this is that one day he sees a woman bathing. Her name is Bathsheba. He sleeps with her. She gets pregnant, but it turns out that she's the wife of one of his lieutenants, one of his main commanders. David has to deal with this guilt somehow. And in order to do this, he sends his lieutenant, he sends his commander off on a dangerous mission. The same type of thing that Saul had done to him when Saul was king. Though on this mission, he actually commands his lieutenants, his commander's subordinates, to abandon him mid-battle. He sets it up to make sure that this man, who's actually himself a Hittite, Uriah the Hittite, to make sure that he dies in battle. He has this man's soldiers abandon him so that he can get him out of the way. Because Uriah is killed in battle, David is then able to marry Bathsheba. She's not the only woman that David took for himself by offing her husband. David had hundreds of wives and concubines. But Bathsheba is pretty important. Her first kid dies, the one that she had when they slept together without being married. But her second kid with David was named Solomon. Now, the book of Samuel, even though Samuel's dead, the book of Samuel ends with Yahweh commanding David to take a census of the people, the head count of the people. Now, when David does this, God says he sinned for doing it. It's not totally clear. God says, take a census. David takes a census, and God goes, oh, why'd you take a census? And in order to get even with David, God kills 70,000 Israelites. There is an account written much later in the book of Chronicles that says it was actually Satan who convinced David to conduct this census. But the author of Samuel had no concept of Satan. Remember, that's going to be the concept of Satan. We'll talk about it later. It comes into Judaism centuries later. It does not exist in Jewish minds during the reign of David. The book of Samuel explicitly says that it was Yahweh, it was God, who had David take the census. And what we really need to remember here is that the Bible is not a single book. Remember that it is a compendium. It is a collection of multiple different books by multiple different authors. Some of the books were written by more than one author. And so we can't expect it to be consistent all the way through. The book of Kings opens up with David being old, and there is some struggle over who's going to be his heir, who takes over next. But David chooses the son he had with Bathsheba, Solomon, as his next king. Solomon, when he becomes king, maybe around the year 960 or so, Solomon, his first move is to kill people he thought were David's enemies, including one that was in a Levite sacred city that he was not supposed to go into and kill people in, but he's trying to secure his reign. After committing these atrocities, he does a lot of worthy and very wise things. He travels around the kingdom to make sacrifices at all the high places, or at many of the high places. He becomes famous for delivering wise judgment. The most famous, or the one that really is highlighted in the Bible to show that Solomon truly was this wise judge. There are two women that come to him that say that a child, a baby, is both of theirs. One of them had the baby, and then she said that it was true that when she fell asleep, another woman who had lost her son kidnapped her baby and then put the dead baby in its place. It's a whole kerfuffle. And so Solomon has the baby brought before him, and he says, I can't figure out which one of you this baby belongs to, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the baby in half, and each of you can have half. Well, one of the women, this is the woman who it's really her kid, is so upset. She says, nope, don't kill him. I'd rather he live. Give him to the other woman, even though she's not his mom. Solomon then recognizes that, of course, this woman is the true mother. Any mother would not allow her son or her child to be chopped in half. This is given as evidence that Solomon is a truly wise judge for his people. And later tradition will be that Solomon wrote most of the Proverbs. Just as David had written the Psalms, or most of the Psalms and songs to God, Solomon had written most of the Proverbs, the wisdom sayings that help people guide themselves through life when they are faced with difficult decisions. Solomon then hires the king of Tyre, a Phoenician city-state, just like how David had hired Phoenicians to build his palace. Solomon hires the king of Tyre to build his temple on Mount Moriah. He gives the king 20 towns in Galilee as payment, just gives away a bunch of Israelite towns to the king of Tyre, but that's what it's going to take to get to build God's house in Jerusalem.
And the temple that's built has a lot of Phoenician-style elements to it. It's the same rectangular shape with the two divisions that we see in other Phoenician temples. It's decorated with these very sphinx-like creatures that we refer to as cherubim. It's worth remembering that the Phoenicians and the Israelites were very closely related. They're both Canaanite peoples.
Solomon then builds a navy, and he trades with the Queen of Sheba across the Red Sea. Again, we don't have necessarily archaeological evidence for this, but we do know that people who lived across the Red Sea in the area of modern-day Somalia and Ethiopia actually spoke similar languages to the people that lived in Arabia and not too far from Canaan. So there does seem to be a connection here that the Bible is alluding to. Like David, Solomon struggled with corruption, particularly when it came to women he was attracted to. And this is one of those things, we've talked about patriarchy before, but I want to emphasize patriarchy pops up again and again and again, and consistently, not just in the Bronze Age, not just in Mesopotamia, but also throughout the Old Testament. Women are continually blamed for men's problems. Eve is blamed for the fact that Adam chose to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Women are often blamed for Solomon not being able to control himself. Like his dad, Solomon had hundreds of wives and concubines, and he even married women from peoples that God told him not to marry. As he got older, his foreign wives convinced him to worship other gods as well. which again is kind of weird if Solomon is able to actually have direct connection with Yahweh, but somehow or other he decides to worship other gods that he doesn't have direct connection with. God considers punishing Solomon for these sins, but he thinks such a punishment would make David feel bad. Remember, he had promised David that his descendants would be in charge forever, and Solomon is David's favorite son. So God decides instead of punishing Solomon, he'll punish Solomon's son. After Solomon dies, around the year 920 BCE, his son Rehoboam becomes the king. But a lot of the people from the northern kingdom of Israel were unhappy with Solomon's rule. They felt like he had taxed them too hard. They weren't happy with Rehoboam. Remember that David came from the tribe of Judah, which means that Solomon is also from the tribe of Judah, which means that Rehoboam is also from the tribe of Judah. The northern Israelite tribes are starting to feel like they're being used by the tribe of Judah. Rehoboam, for his part, instead of having a lighter touch and trying to bring in those Israelite tribes, keep the kingdom unified, he governs with an even heavier hand. He taxes them even harder. He expects even more for them. And the northern tribes end up rebelling against Rehoboam, and they set up their own king. And with this, somewhere around the year 900-ish, the unified kingdom of Israel gets split in two. And we end up with the southern kingdom of Judah, ruled from Jerusalem, and the northern kingdom of Israel, ruled from the city of Samaria. And sometimes that kingdom is called the Kingdom of Samaria. Now, once again, we don't actually have any archaeological evidence for a unification between these two kingdoms, if they were ever unified, but the Bible tells us that at one point the Israelites were unified, and then around the year 900-ish, they get separated into two kingdoms. The rest of the book of Kings is about these two kingdoms. Now, the Deuteronomist, the person that probably wrote the book of Kings, came from the kingdom of Judah. So there's a lot of smack talking about Israel/Samaria. So, it's said that their kings, because they don't have the temple in Jerusalem, their kings build two temples in the north and in the south. And in these temples, they set up golden calves. Should kind of remind us of Aaron's golden calf. And while we know at least one of these temples existed because we have found it, we're not so sure that these golden calves were so different in the north than they were in the south. Now, it is worth pointing out that the Israelites in the north are much more closely attached to Canaanite culture. This focus on being anti-calf or bull worship, it seems to be a heavy Judean thing, doesn't seem to be as much of an issue up in Israel. Now, starting in the 9th century, starting in the 800s, which would not be long after Solomon, we actually start getting evidence for the Israelite kingdoms, including an actual reference to the house of David in the Tel Dan Stele. It is after the book of Kings that Israelite/Judean history starts to line up with the other evidence that we have available to us.